it's called Cogito study from Professor Lindenberger from the Max Planck Institute, who made a 100-day study with 200 people, younger people, 100 older people, and he wanted to find out if you do this cognitive brain training, does this has positive effects for non-trained tasks? And this is the case. So with his study, he showed that with these kind of cognitive training tasks, of course, you're improving for these specific tasks, but you also improve for non-trained tasks, which is really important because this is what we want. So what people should really achieve with our brain training software. Last not least, I wanted to give you a short overview about other brain training software competitors in the market. Rumosity, it's a US company, they're very famous in the US, number one in the consumer market, 30 million users. There's a software called CogPack from a German psychologist. He's very successful in the medical market. But his software is a little bit old-fashioned, so it's 25 years, or he started 25 years ago with the software, so it's a little bit MS-DOS user interface, so people don't like it so much anymore. Then, of course, there is the Nintendo Brain Age, or Train Your Brain with Dr. Kawashima, the game which Nintendo has done with Dr. Kawashima. There are some Facebook games like Brain Buddies, who has the biggest brain, and there's another online game, Neuronation, also a German company. So, yeah, thanks for your time. If you want to see more, if you have some questions, want to see it live, please pass by. I'm at the booth number 11. Thanks.
If there's any quick burning questions for Stefan, I'm happy to take one. Yes, from Jan on the left there, please. Look at the speed of that man.
How are you going to make of what is your key success to make it a commercial success? And I think that's a lot of companies are struggling with that. We have a big idea, but how to commercialize it and to make it for our large group.
Okay, I think first is that we combined, or that we are coming from the gaming side, so we really make it like looking very nice game, you know, with motivation to keep the players motivated. So it's not a kind of just only a health product. So we're really coming from the mass market, which you see with the graphics, with the game design. So I think that's very important. And of course we have the background, so we have 10 years experience how to market games. We know lots of people in the industry. Otherwise we would never be able, for example, to get in touch with Dr. Kawashima. It was very difficult. So, and we know people in the gaming market, so we know how to bring a product into the mass market. But when we started to develop our first brain trainer, always these medical or the scientific proven, or the scientific background and the medical market was always in mind. So far, we have concentrated on the mass market, but with this mybraintraining.com, we really want to make a shift into the medical market, health market, which is not so easy to crack.
Great. Lovely. Thank you,
Yeah,
Stefan.
thanks.
Okay, let me welcome to the platform our fourth speaker. So Adam Lovell, who's a PhD candidate at Wadley University, Nijmegen, but I think a native New Yorker.
That's
if
correct.
I'm right. Great. Adam's going to talk to us about how parents mediate children's video gameplay and why it matters. Adam.
Thank you for the introduction, John. Thank you all for being here. Yes, my name is Adam Lovell, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Radboud University in Nijmegen. And my topic today is actually a bit of a shift in gears, because until now we've mostly been focusing on the cognitive effects of games, so ways in which they make our reaction times faster, our working memory, our old memories. But my research is primarily about the positive effects that games have on people's personality and on their behaviors. I'm going to make that really clear. In that, my talk is essentially about this comic. In it, we see two parents. They've made their way to a very idyllic place in their lives, and they're overlooking the prairie, and they say, "I thank my lucky stars that we live in a quiet place where our kids aren't influenced by gangs and the violence of the big city." And meanwhile, what has crept into their home is these terrible video games that are corrupting their child's mind. And we can actually look at his face, this gleeful grin, we can see that he's become possessed by these video games. And the question I want to explore with you today is, what can these parents do? How can they stop these video games from having terrible consequences for these children over their development? I'm going to do this in 3 parts. First, I'm going to cover what are the different techniques that parents can actually use to mediate how their children are using video games in their lives. And for that, I'm going to be calling on research from the television field, where there's a much longer tradition of research. That will segue into a study that we conducted looking at these different techniques, whether they apply to the video game, whether they apply in the realm of video gameplay, and again, which ones of these are working. And I'll close by mentioning some of what are the values and the limitations of this research. So let's talk really quickly about television. Now, again, of course, television research has been around for much longer, while TV has been a prominent part of modern culture for far longer than video games, so it shouldn't surprise you. And what about 20 years of research in media and communication psychology shows is that parents have essentially 3 tools for mediating and influencing how their children consume television. That is restrictive, that is setting rules and boundaries about the content and the amount of time that their children can engage in television or consume TV. Then there's active mediation. This involves just communicating with their children about the content that they're consuming on television. And co-viewing, spending time together in front of the screen. But when we think about video games, we really have to ask ourselves a very important question, and that is, do these forms of mediating their behavior of video games also apply? And I think that this is a very important question to consider for at least 3 reasons. That is, I think that we can distinguish the 3 aspects of video games that make them unique from television in a way that might change the way in which parents will mediate their children's use of video games. The first is that games are inherently interactive. Games include feedback loops where your activity in the game is being rewarded or punished dynamically in a system. And whereas television is a passive experience. So this might change the way parents view the entire medium. The second thing is that video games allow for people remotely to co-play or to co-view. So you wouldn't ever really think of watching a TV show with your friend who lives down the block, but you can do this with the internet with your video games. And finally, again, television has been around for a very long time, but video games seem to suffer from something of a generation gap when it comes to the parents and the children. And paradoxically, on the one hand, a lot of parents think, well, these games are too childish. And on the other hand, they might also feel, oh man, everything that's happening in these games is so complicated. And these are both boundaries for them to be playing games with their children. And these are all different reasons why we might expect that video games might have that parents might engage in different behaviors for changing the way and influencing the way that their children play video games. So there was a seminal study that was conducted here in the Netherlands by Peter Nieken and Jeroen Jans in 2006, where they essentially took these 3 forms of mediation, transformed them into video games. That is, they took co-viewing and they transformed it into co-playing, and they submitted a questionnaire to a large sample of Dutch parents and children with a wide age range, and trying to examine, does this paradigm, do these 3 forms of mediating behavior apply to video games? And I just want to quickly go over what some of these scales, the items included in these scales. So for restrictive, it wasn't purely about setting rules, but restrictive mediation also includes behaviors that parents engage in order so that they can restrict the gaming. So this would include monitoring what games they're playing, forbidding certain games, of course, and reading the game descriptions. Items for an active engagement, just to give you a clear picture, is just pointing out good things about games or pointing out bad things about games, explaining what's happening. It's purely about engaging with children about the content of what's occurring. And co-playing is self-explanatory. This was a large-scale study, and it's a very nice paper. I can really recommend it. And essentially, the data supported this setup, this paradigm of 3 ways of mediating children's video game play. It's a really nice study. It's a seminal work, but it doesn't really get to the heart of what I want to talk to you about today, and that is, it doesn't really tell us anything about how it is that the ways in which parents mediate their gameplay has an influence on their children, or has an influence on how games influence their children. So so what we look to do is we ran a study where we also assessed children's conduct problems, and secondly, we also decided to narrow the bandwidth of the age limit within our sample. So instead of looking at a large group from 8 to 18, as you would expect, there might be great variability in ways that parents mediate their kids' gaming behavior, we looked at a much smaller sample. So a much smaller age range, excuse me. So our focus is on 7.5 to 11.5-year-old children, also throughout the Netherlands. A large sample, 174 parents, 16 children, 16 siblings, sibling cases, so a total of 194 children. The gender was also split right down the middle, very important. So the first, and the next step, another important thing to point out about this study is that we also added some additional items to Jeroen and Peter's list. And that this is, one is because this was based on other survey materials that are out in the field that we thought were theoretically relevant, such as being in the same room as the child as they're playing, or advising them against copying what's happening in the game. And we also thought that this would provide an even stronger test for whether or not these three, whether this paradigm of these three forms of mediation actually still really apply. And the first thing that we have to report is that this breakup of three was not exactly what we found in our data. What emerged from our analyses when we asked these parents all these questions was, instead of a 3-factor structure, what we observe is 4 factors. And the distinction that's important to make here is the difference between monitoring and restrictive, where items that were purely about watching and overseeing what is it that children are playing were loading on a completely separate factor from items that were specifically about restricting their gaming. But let's now get to the heart of the matter. Let's talk about what can parents really do to stop video games from having this negative impact on their children. So I'm just going to quickly walk you through an overview of the analyses that we ran. In the first step, we look to establish whether or not time spent playing video games is going to be positively associated with misconduct. So is it in fact true that the more that the kids in our sample are playing games, the poorer their behavior? That's the first step. The second step is then to look at purely examining what is the relationship between these different forms of mediating their behavior on misconduct. The third step is then to examine, is there some sort of relationship between the amount of time that the kids are playing and the different types of mediation that the parents are engaging in. And finally, in the fourth step, we test, we run a test where we are essentially comparing the influence of the amount of time against the influence of these different strategies that the parents are running. So let's look at step one. Step one is the underlying assumption. Video games bad for children. And in our sample, this is exactly what we observed. The more amount of time that the parents reported their children playing video games, the more that they also reported their children having conduct problems. So there's a problem. How can we solve it? Step two, we want to see which of these ways of mediation might be influencing their bad behavior. And we observed something that's quite interesting. First of all, this monitoring scale, which I mentioned to you as being completely separate from restriction, this was negatively predicting conduct problems. So the more monitoring, the less conduct problems. And strangely, and I'm going to say it's actually quite an anomalous result, because as we walk through step 3 and step 4, this result actually disappears. But in this step of the analysis, we actually observe that the more that parents co-played, the more conduct problems, which would be quite contrary to your expectations. We can talk about it in the discussion if there's time. In the third step of the analysis, then, we want to look at the association between gaming and the ways in which that parents mediate their children's gaming behaviors. And there we only observed a negative association between the amount of time and monitoring. That means that the more that the children play video games, the less it was that the parents were monitoring. Now comes the fourth step. Remember, and if we look at the relationship again, if we look at the relationship between the amount of time gaming and co-play, we see no association. Again, it was a bit of an anomalous finding. Now this is where it gets interesting. Remember, the amount of time these kids are playing video games is positively associated with conduct problems. The more they play, the worse their behavior. But if we include in the model only monitoring, and we test to see what is having the influence on their conduct problems, what we see is that the amount of gaming is no longer significant. So, and what remains still is the fact that the amount of time that the extent to which the parents are monitoring their children's behavior is still negatively associated with conduct problems. That is, that more monitoring, less conduct problems, regardless of the amount of time that the children are playing. And as a result of the fact that this amount of time gaming, it becomes insignificant in this model, it seems to indicate that the reason why amount of time gaming is associated with conduct problems may very well be because it is indicative of the fact that parents are not monitoring their children while they play games. And again, this co-play did not show up as being a significant factor in this final model. So a bit of an anomalous finding. I want to now wrap up with some of the limitations of this study. First of all, just very obviously, there are some serious questions. We really need to examine this in terms of causality. So this was run one time. This is a purely correlational study. So what really needs to be done is children need to be tracked over time. And related to this issue is the direction of the different directions that that we can pose these hypotheses. So is it that the amount of time gaming is the one that's predicting conduct problems, or does conduct problems mean that the children are playing more video games? These are both questions that cannot really be resolved with at this level of analysis. The other aspect, the other limitation here is that this was quite insensitive to the complexity that is video games. I hate getting up on stage and talking about video games as this edifice of this one unified thing, when in fact video games occupy a vast space of social and non-social, complex and simple. So this is quite an oversimplification that future research really should take into account. As for conclusions, so first is, it seems that video game mediation in younger children, video game mediation seems to be unique compared to TV. That's what we observed in our sample. And it's possible that there's this age-related differences in parental mediation strategies. That is, when we compare our sample to that from Niket and Jans, then we can see that it's possible that because we're looking at a smaller group, this is why we're observing different strategies. Take-home message for the parents out there, it really seems monitor what your kids are playing. And if you're a designer, I would say design for transparency. Make it so that it's clear what the content in your game is, so that it makes it easier for parents to monitor what's happening in games. Thank you all for your attention, and thank you to everybody that made this study possible. My supervisors, Isabel Granick and Rutger Engels. If you guys are here tomorrow, Isabel's giving a great talk on a game that she's designing. I highly recommend you attend. It'll be in this room. And thank you to all my master's students for collecting the data for this project.
Okay, I'm going to assume it's going to take the other two tracks a little while to get here. So do we have one question for Adam? Yeah. Let's go to the gentleman on the far left there, please.
Thank you for an interesting talk. I wondered if there was another confounding factor in your data, in as much as the parents may already have a preconceived idea that if their kids are playing games for a long time, they're going to be bad kids, and therefore they're looking out, in terms of reporting the misconduct. And the other thing about that is also that, of course, the parents that both it, they think they're good parents because they're monitoring and they're not looking out for the bad behaviour, they're forgiving the bad behaviour. So could that be, could both of those things confound to?
Yeah, those are both excellent questions. With regards to your first statement about different beliefs that the parents might hold about video games, the original paper that was by Niket and Jans, that paper centered very much around that idea. And so they actually measured various beliefs that parents hold about children. We included that in our study as well. And we didn't observe any associations between parental beliefs about gaming and different styles, which it was contrary to the findings from Niket and Jans. And we also didn't observe any associations between their expectations for games being good or bad and conduct problems. But that's an excellent question. And your second question was with regards to, I'm sorry, you have to remind me.
Actually, can
Do
I?
you recall?
Yeah, no, I don't. All I do.
I'm
but
sorry.
I think if I could ask you maybe to hook up after the session and
Yeah.
we can talk about
I
that. Just to-
apologize.
So, fantastic. Great to have a taxonomy. Great to have the research.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Okay, the last update I have is the surgeon is Google Glassed and on her way to the surgical room. So we're looking good. And I'm just going to spend a little time introducing our last speakers for this session. So welcome to Dr. Zrusan Savitsky and Dr. Siv Johansson, psychologist. Thank you very much. And they're going to talk to us about games as psychotherapy. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. And this little device here